there has to be a way for us to be able to beat these tariffs. And so the reality of that is we can, but it's again going back to those red tape policies, finding what they are and repealing them, readdressing our treaty rights and reaffirming them. So, right now, as far as our abilities to end, we have hindering us the Indian Commerce Clause, which is the U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 8. That gives Congress the exclusive power to regulate commerce with the Indian tribes. This is the legal backbone for federal control of trade, tariff rules applied to tribes, restriction of tribal trade with foreign nations, limits on intertribal commerce, limits on creating independent trade agreements. So, how this impacts us as nations, we cannot freely trade internationally or across state lines without federal oversight. Again, that's another red tape policy that a lot of our people, when we talk about land back, people say, let's start trading with other nations. Unfortunately, let's address these. Let's address the Indian Commerce Clause, Article 1, Section 8, where that right is hindered. And then there's the Indian Trader Statutes, which is 25 USC 261, 264, originally meant to protect tribes from unfair traders. Now it's used to justify federal control over who we trade with, control over licensing of our trade, and pricing and merchant regulation. So it prevents tribes from forming independent trade supply chains across, internationally, or tariff systems. So another red tape policy that we have to address if we are going to protect our people from tariffs. Right now, no protection. Our protection right now is relying on the federal government to have the tribal nations in mind when they make policies. Right now, because of the uneducated politicians in Congress at all levels, we are not seeing us being a part of those different things. And so then we have the Major Crimes Act, and how does this impact us? Creates federal criminal jurisdiction. This prevents tribes from full control over business enforcement, commercial regulation, and tribal civil enforcement. So it weakens our tribal courts and tribal regulatory authority, which businesses need to confidently be trading and dealing with these tariff policies on a government-to-government level. Again, red tape policy. We have to go back to the Appropriations Act, back to the Reorganization Act, and make sure that those things aren't hindering our right to make treaties, rights to form our own governance. The Indian Reorganization Act, unfortunately, is a thing that's hindering a lot of these things. So even things like Public Law 280, it gives state jurisdiction in many tribal lands. So this weakens tribal economic independence. So a lot of these things, it confuses taxation rights. It discourages investors because of mixed jurisdiction, things like that. This all plays into our ability to protect our nations from these tariffs. So, this is another thing that we need to address. And another thing, like I said, a lot of these, you'll be like, what does that have to do with it? But it's in that fine print. That's where we have to really be looking, because the Dawes Act, the allotment policies, they still are affecting the economics 140 years later. So it created that checkered board jurisdiction, fractionated land that cannot be used economically, unclear ownership. So what that does is, again, it means that tribes can't build large-scale infrastructure, agriculture, energy, or a trade corridor. That's why we're not seeing any development. And maybe we can give tribal councils the benefit of the doubt, but they're not speaking on these things. They're not saying, hey, look at these acts of Congress. They're getting in the way of our tribal inherent treaty rights. We're not seeing that. So then we can start to blame them. We can start to say your inaction is leading to our active genocide. And then we have the Sarciri v. Salazar, 2009. That Supreme Court decision that says the U.S. can only take land into trust for tribes under federal jurisdiction in 1934. So this blocks land reacquisition, makes it impossible to rebuild economic bases, and it limits land for agriculture, housing, manufacturing, and trade zones. Again, stuff that would protect us from tariffs from action from the United States, uh, they've covered all their bases. I think all of these acts and these policies were put into place because of a native nation stepping into their tribal rights and the states not liking it. At the time, they were able to do things, push things through so easily. It was unbelievable. Now we're in 2025. If we go back, if we start re examining a lot of these things, the United States was acting illegally on many of them. So there we can actually start to protect our people from these different policies that the United States is enacting on themselves, on their own people, and in turn their domestic dependents, the 576 nations in the United States. So then there's the tribal land cannot be used as collateral, trust land restrictions. So the federal trust status means that tribes cannot mortgage land, cannot use land to raise capital, cannot leverage land like every other government or corporation. So this blocks the creation of native banks, native lending systems, and native owned trade centers. Again, protection for when laws like tariffs are in effect and impact our ability to keep our economies, our people going, and that again plays into our domestic dependence. We need to address that as well. And then there's the federal tariff regime, custom laws, Title 19, that applies to tribal imports in the same way as foreign nations, but without the exemption system that other sovereign nations negotiate. Tribes cannot negotiate tariff rates. They cannot create free trade agreements. They cannot establish independent ports of entry. Then we have the U.S. economic and regulatory system that blocks tribal trade. There's the IRS dual taxation. That's the biggest economic killer. States tax tribal businesses, non-native contractors, energy projects, sales on tribal lands. And so every project becomes financially unviable. So billions of dollars lost annually. And that's why we're not seeing people coming in and really establishing what they could for tribal nations. Then we have the BIA regulatory gridlock. The BIA regulations slow land approvals, leasing, infrastructure, energy development, and trade permits. So projects that take 3 to 6 months in the outside would take 3 to 6 years. And we see that in Indian country. We see that on so many levels. And whether that's tribal nations' faults or not, again, if it isn't their fault, they would be speaking on it. And I'm not seeing them speaking on it on that level. So then there's the federal banking restrictions. Tribes are barred from direct access to capital markets, creating federal recognized banks, and participating fully in FDIC programs. So banks don't invest. They don't invest in protecting our nations from American policies, and investors avoid tribal economic development because there's no certainty in it, and most of the time there's a certainty of failure. So there's a whole lot of different things that is hindering our right to protect our own people from tariffs, and those are just a few of them.